All right, welcome to another episode of Hickory Street Podcast. This is the part 2 of my World War One history review. And I just want to say this book was very difficult to read for a number of reasons. One, this book is pretty long in general. It's a little over 400 pages, so that's been, a barrier as to why it took a little bit for me to get to the end of this book, but also, realistically, just the gruesome things that are detailed in this book. It's very hard to continue reading these personal accounts from people and just realizing that the horrors of war affected so many people for a relatively short period of time. But there's a lot of detail in this book about the different countries and their involvement in the war. And just to give a brief overview, the countries that were involved in World War One were not, just Germany, Russia, Italy, Britain, France, and Austria, but it also included Turkey, Czechoslovakia, Australia, Canada, the U.S., parts of Syria, the Balkans region, Ukraine, I'm trying to think. It bled into the Ottoman Empire, Jerusalem in particular was really involved. Just an innumerable amount of countries were involved in this. And what's very interesting to me reading this book was how almost from the start of the war, that was my phone, almost from the start of the war, there were very high up diplomats and political actors that were calling for the end of the war from pretty much the very beginning in 1914. And what's kind of strange about the beginning of the end of the war is that it 100% coincided with the fall of the Russian monarchy. And the Russian monarchy fell for a number of different reasons. One, the war was highly unpopular, but also the Kingdom of Russia at the time was very much so kind of at the end of its lifespan in terms of economic and social influence over the populace. So whenever the war started, Russia did not have an army that was formidable against the Germans directly. And the book goes into a lot of the logistics of it, but the Russian army was actually fairly small, and they recruited heavily and made military service mandatory. And that was wildly unpopular. And then, as the war went on, the economics involved of maintaining food supply and their issues of class inequality had reached a pinnacle point in 1917, and a lot of the Russian generals that were commanding armies in the Middle East, with respect to the locations around Turkey and within the Ottoman Empire, and in Ukraine, a lot of these generals that were commanding armies whenever the revolution happened in Russia that destabilized their government, they were left exposed, and a lot of them sort of created their own personal form of control over their army, and retaliated not only against these governments that were still trying to, attack based off of the precedent of war, but also against their own citizens that were trying to rebel. And so there were countless generals that were assassinated at the fall of the Russian government, and it really destabilized the whole region. But the thing is, whenever it comes to the end of the war, and I mean, like I said, I don't remember every specific detail listed in this book because it's over 500 pages long. But whenever it comes to the end of the war, it really appears to me to be that the thing that precipitated the end of the war was the fall of Russia. But the fall of Russia was actually kind of the result of sentiments that were held all over Europe at the time. And really what it came down to was that Germans were tired, not only just militarily, but politically and logistically. Their manpower and strength had dwindled because of how long they had been pursuing this war. And they actually had a very strong manpower advantage at the beginning of the war, which is why they were able to persist within it for so long. But as Russia began to fall, what ended up happening is Germany was able to negotiate peace terms on the Eastern Front that was leading into the Middle East. And see, the war in the Middle East was mainly controlled by the Austrian government, the Austrian government, along with the rest of the Middle Eastern countries, but Britain and France had a very strong influence in the region, but the focus of Britain and France and Germany had been all on the Western Front because they were trying to protect France. And Germany was trying to, gain control in France, tactically speaking, because they saw that as being their ticket to winning the war, essentially. But the war in France had been a stalemate, essentially, for a very long time. And I mentioned it in my last video, but it didn't really go anywhere. And so whenever Germany had to expand into the Eastern Front to fight Russia and Austria, and then continue on into like Czechoslovakia and then into the Ottoman Empire, the German military resources were starting to be stretched pretty thin. So whenever Russia fell, Germany was then able to focus their attention back over to the Western Front, and all of the troops that were on the Eastern Front were able to be transported back to the Western Front. And that created a very real concern for Britain and France, because they were going to be losing tactically. So even though Russia negotiating for peace at the fall of their monarchy, it wasn't exactly the end of the war, because Germany ramped up their focus on the Eastern Front. On the Western Front. So, at the time, America had began to get more involved. They had a very large shipbuilding mission, and they were starting to send more resources, and we started to send troops, but we were sending them at a slower rate than what Britain and France would have liked, and it caused a lot of strife. But as the war shifted to the Eastern Front, shifted back to the Western Front, Britain and America got more and more involved, and that is sort of what ultimately brought the end of the war, because Germany was essentially at that point fighting three national superpowers, and Italy, in their support of Germany, had shifted, and Italy was negotiating for peace, and it was expected that they weren't going to be sending any more troops to aid the Germans. So, logistically speaking, the Germans had exhausted pretty much every resource available to them by 1918. And with America just starting to get more involved in the resources that were at our disposal, if they didn't negotiate for treaties to end the war, it was very unpopular in their country to begin with, they would have risked being open to invasion, essentially. And not only would they have risked being open to invasion, but all of the supporting countries would have also been kind of fraught with other risks, like economic risks. So it was really it wasn't like necessarily one thing that ended the war. The wars began to end in 1917 by region, because Germany negotiated peace settlements in the East first, and then almost a year later, the war had ended. But before the beginning of the end of the war, whenever, like in 1916, there were lots of moments when Germany was very, very close to beating the French and Britain. At one point, the French army had so many deserters in, like the hundreds of thousands, that their army was effectively useless. It was mainly the Canadians and the Australians and the British that were defending France at one point, with a very small number of French troops that were willing to continue fighting. The French infantry were completely gassed out. A lot of them were court-martialed and executed. There's a couple of different stories of, tens of thousands of French troops disobeying orders and refusing to go to the front lines, which put more pressure on Britain. But it was mainly whenever you kind of look at it from a bird's eye view, it was mainly the British control of the sea that kept them in a leveraged position tactically, and that awarded them a lot of time. And it allowed them to transport resources much more effectively than the Germans were able to, because they had to transport everything by land, which was a lot slower and for a lot of different reasons. There were also some major railway deaths from attacks on trains transporting soldiers or materials. Also, just traveling by land in Europe was a lot more dangerous than traveling by sea, because of all of the military checkpoints and the regions constantly being taken over and then switching over to another country's hand. So, the effects of World War I really set up the stage for World War II, because at the end of World War I, in order to prevent Germany from using its military might and turning their tactical or their locational disadvantage into a tactical advantage, they we sanctioned them fairly heavily and restricted their military, and it was wildly unpopular. But something that kind of goes unnoticed with regards to the end of World War I is that the dynamics that happened afterwards with the fall of the Ottoman Empire in the Middle East drastically changed the formation of communications in the Eastern Hemisphere, in the eastern part of Europe and in the Middle East. And it's something that we're still facing today. It has a lot of cultural implications for, Russia and their decision to invade Ukraine, and a lot of the things that have happened post World War II, even with the creation of certain Middle Eastern governments. At the end of World War I, there was more of a I mean, it wasn't exactly, but it was closer to a neutral agreement than at the end of World War II, arguably. And there was very specific reasons for that, because World War I was designed, or the treaty at the end of World War I was designed to prevent another world war. So we kind of just allowed everybody to reclaim the borders that existed before World War I began, with the exception of Germany. Germany lost a lot of territory, and they were also economically sanctioned very heavily. But the technology aspect of war was very, very new, and each country dealt with it within their own way. And you have to kind of think about the effect of the Industrial Revolution and the fact that each country was at a different stage and had access to different resources, specifically with the more Western countries having more access to weapons technology that the East did not have the luxury of, specifically like Russia. I mean, Russia was transporting a lot of their troops via horseback, and their cavalry was still used quite a bit, along with Germany as well. Germany used a lot of cavalry, but the introduction of the tank in 1916 was a game changer. And there were a lot of design flaws, so thankfully the tanks that were used ended up having to be abandoned because there was a design flaw of the German tank, which was that the belt for transportation of the tank was falling off as they were making their way into France. And so even though they were very useful in pushing closer and further into France in the middle of the war, they ended up being stalled. And it was kind of it was kind of a shock militarily to France and Britain, and then Britain had designed their own tank that they had attempted to use that was smaller, but their thought process was, and the book goes into it, is that if they could use 2 or 3 mobile tanks to take out one of their tanks, then it would be useful. And so what ended up happening is they made a lot more tanks. It was a very expensive endeavor for them, and they were only able to really use them for, I don't know, like a good 6 months within the war, and then it just became too expensive for them to continue making them. So they sort of focused their attention on garnering, ships from the U.S. So the U.S. started building them ships. The use of the submarine by the Germans was extremely effective. The Germans was able to take down several different British warships, as well as civilian ships. The Germans were really kind of known for targeting civilian ships throughout the war, and as the war got closer and closer to ending, they ramped up their sinking of British and American ships, until they were finally forced into a position of submission, at risk of, their country falling apart, essentially. But overall, a great read. If I had to give this book like a rating, as far as, the average book reader's ability to, take a lot of this information in and its readability, I would give it probably like a 6. I think it's easy to understand. There's just so much information and so many names that are thrown out in this book that remembering them is going to be impossible for most readers. It's also written in a way that at some points is not very captivating. At other points it's very captivating, but at some points it's fairly redundant and moves a little bit slower, I think. But yeah, so that's the second part of this review on World War I, and I encourage you to look up more facts on your own time, either via YouTube, or by buying this book, or other World War I related books. The next book I'm going to be reading is about the Civil War. It's called A Fiery Trial. I'm really excited to start that one. So I will be reading that one, and then in the meantime, I'm going to do another music review. I'll probably be doing a music review sometime in the next 2 weeks, 2 or 3 weeks. So be on the lookout for that. All right. Thanks for tuning in.